Greetings and welcome back to Dr. Izad's distance learning class. As we are nearing the end of the distance learning challenge tower, we should now be moving on to the assignment entitled The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian and the Joy Luck Club LAT. Note how there is no exemplar for this assignment, as I will not be posting one. The reason for this is that I do not want the students to feel incentivized to copy my exemplar and simply swap out a few words, as that undermines the purpose of completing the assignment. Students should complete assignments so they can practice developing and communicating their own complex thoughts. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the struggle to develop and communicate complex thoughts has to be evident in student work, and that will not be even remotely present should the assignment be completed as I had previously described, by simply copying most of the exemplar. As such, this video will take a different approach in encouraging students to develop ideas. We will first start with reading the prompt. Take the time to pause the screen and carefully read the prompt and determine what is being asked of you. Please, leave your response as a class comment for your weekly participation in response to the weekly discussion topic. You may have noticed the two verbs saying that we have to compare and contrast. You also might have noticed that we are being asked to compare and contrast the author's use of voice in two texts, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian and The Joy Luck Club. Take another moment to stop and pause the video and determine what specific elements of each text are being analyzed, and remember that comparing and contrasting is a type of analysis if we are analyzing each author's use of voice. Again, you may leave your response as a class comment for your weekly participation in response to the weekly discussion topic. You may have remembered from the previous assignments that voice refers to how the author tells the story in the novel. Therefore, an author's voice can be characterized by use of figurative language, use of humor, use of sarcasm, unconventional text structure. That last one, unconventional text structure, is the element of voice we focused on in our critique of Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club. If you'll remember, Amy Tan's use of parables to begin each section of her novel was a characteristic of her voice. You may also have remembered identifying her purpose for writing and evaluating her use of voice for that purpose. For example, some students argued that her purpose for writing was to tell the story of all Chinese immigrants, and that Tan's use of voice was effective because the relationship between each individual's conflict and the Chinese parables make it clear that the characters' conflicts are intended to represent Chinese people as a whole. Alternatively, some students identified Amy Tan's purpose as being to relay her own personal experiences to the audience, so her use of voice would have been ineffective for that purpose. Considering that the Joy Luck Club project had us evaluating Tan's use of voice in such a way, how do you suppose we can compare and contrast Sherman Alexi's use of voice? As always, feel free to pause the video and leave a response as a class comment. There are a number of ways to approach this. We can determine how different elements characterize each author's respective voices for similar or different purposes. We may even come to the conclusion that the same elements characterize each author's use of voice for similar or different purposes, and we can determine which author incorporated those elements into his or her voice more effectively. And for your discussion about the Joy Luck Club, I am not limiting you to discussing Amy Tan's use of voice to her use of parables. You may compare and contrast other elements of her use of voice, with respect to a specific purpose, to Sherman Alexi's. For example, you may discuss Amy Tan's use of first-person narration as her voice, for the purpose of telling her own story through fictional characters. Important to note is the fact that Tan specifically uses multiple first-person narration, as there are multiple characters through which she uses first-person narration to tell her story. Why might she have done this, considering both her Chinese and American heritage? That might be something to think about when you are comparing Tan's use of first-person narration to Alexi's. You may alternatively want to discuss Amy Tan's use of Chinese English dialects when writing dialogue for the maternal characters, and standard English dialects when the Chinese American characters are speaking or narrating the text. This is perhaps done with the purpose of emphasizing the difficulties in Chinese mothers being able to communicate with and understand their Chinese American daughters. Another thing you might want to focus on is Tan's use of allusion. Allusion is when an author makes references to other well-known stories, and Amy Tan might do this with the purpose of emphasizing the grand nature of the dreams immigrant families have for themselves when moving to America. Now compare this to Sherman Alexie's use of voice in The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. How is his use of voice similar or different? Again, you may pause the video and leave a class comment. You might have noticed that it was different because he doesn't use parables to begin his semi-autobiographical memoir. You might have noticed that his use of voice was the same because he uses first-person narration. However, as you read on, you may notice that his use of first-person narration is a little different because he only has one character as the narrator. So his narrative is not told using multiple first-person narration as Tan's is. Alexei also described very serious things, such as his health problems, in a humorous way. This might be done with the purpose of persuading the audience that good can be found even in tragic circumstances. In any case, I presented you with a variety of elements that characterize each author's use of voice and some possible purposes for each author telling his or her story, and this is your starting point. Based on what I discussed, how is Alexei's use of voice similar and or different? Why might those differences exist considering each author's purpose? How might one author's use of voice be more or less effective than the others? These last two questions are things you should consider and address as you develop your response. Be sure to develop the introductory, body, and concluding paragraphs the way I described in previous videos. Revisit those videos if necessary, and reach out to me with any questions about specific things I mentioned in this and other relevant videos.